Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to invite all of you to the New York New York State Political Science Association Conference for 21. This is a panel on international relations, global issues. I'm very happy to introduce our panelist, Jenna Russo, who is a PhD candidate in the City University of New York Graduate Center, and Dr. Luba Rukanska would be serving as the discussant. The way we are going to do this panel is first Jenna is going to present by sharing her screen, sharing the screen and going through her presentation. After that, Luba would discuss the paper, and then we are going to open it up for a discussion session for questions and answers. Having said that, thank you very much. Thank you, Jenna. I will turn over the panel to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today. Let me go ahead and get this set up. Okay, so my name is Jenna Russo. I'm going to be presenting a paper that I've been working on. The title of the paper is A New Era of Protection Posed as a Question, Analyzing Civilian Harm Mitigation in US Military Doctrine and Operations. So over the past 20 years, the protection of civilians has received increasing attention in the academic and policy literature. Now, most of this focus has been in the context of UN peacekeeping operations, and there has really been less focus on implementation of protection of civilians by national governments and military institutions. So this paper is aiming to try and fill that gap, focusing in particular on US implementation of civilian harm mitigation, which I'll define in a minute, into military doctrine, as well as planning and operations. So to jump to the main finding, overall what I find in this research is that while the US has begun to increasingly incorporate civilian harm mitigation, also called CHM for short, into its military doctrine, implementation of CHM has been uneven and largely ad hoc. So this paper is looking at evidence of implementation, in particular in the context of Afghanistan, as well as Syria and Iraq. And it also considers barriers and enablers for implementation, which I'll discuss in a few moments. So before I get into the findings, just to go over a couple of terms. So protection of civilians is understood differently by different organizations. Within US military doctrine, protection of civilians is something of an umbrella term. So it encompasses civilian harm mitigation, which is the main focus of this paper. It also covers mass atrocity response operations, as well as protection from conflict-related sexual violence. So as I said, I'm focusing in particular on CHM, and you can see the definition there according to the US military, which is all measures to avoid or minimize CivCas, which is civilian casualties, and reduce the adverse impact of those that occur. So the first part of the paper, and I won't spend a long time talking about this, but it looks at the extent to which CHM has been integrated into US military doctrine, and in particular, the fact that attention to CHM has increased over time. So I have a couple of these main documents where this has taken place, not only in US military doctrine, but also via presidential policy guidance or PPG on COIN operations, some executive orders that have taken place, and also a number of tactical directives, in particular in the context of Afghanistan with US forces, as well as with NATO forces. And just kind of in brief, we do see that in particular over the last 25 years, there is increasing focus on civilian harm mitigation. And this is as a result of normative pressure that we've seen from a growing human protection regime, as well as operational experiences. And again, in particular in the Iraq and Afghanistan contexts. So the main question then is to look at to what extent have changes in doctrine been implemented into planning and operations. So not just enough to have it in the military doctrine, but is this actually trickling down and influencing planning and operations? So in order to look at that, I look at implementation across a range of areas, which you can see on the screen. So I look at the extent to which they have included civilian harm, tracking, monitoring, and reporting systems into their planning and operations, investigations into reported incidents of civilian harm, post-incident responses, including amends to victims and victims' families, as well as changes in weapons and other technology. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because what I really wanted to spend my time talking about today, and arguably of what is of greatest importance, is whether or not any of these changes have actually led to a reduction in civilian harm. Because again, it's a little bit of lip service if it's only a doctrine, but it's not actually making a difference in the lives of civilians. So in trying to analyze whether or not integration of civilian harm mitigation has actually reduced civilian casualties, there are a couple of different approaches that can be taken. It's not as easy as simply counting the number of people who have been killed or injured, because death counts can be misleading, of course, because they are affected by the tempo and severity of the fighting. So there are a few different approaches that can be taken to try and measure change in civilian casualties. And I use two different approaches in this paper. So the first approach is to look at the number of civilian deaths per strike, and then looking for change over time. And then the second approach would be to look at the percentage of total casualties that were committed by US forces. So in other words, if the US is taking steps to reduce civilian casualties, we would expect that the total percent attributable to US forces would be going down, even as the real number of civilian casualties may remain constant or even increase due to the severity of the fighting. So first I'll talk about a few findings from Afghanistan. So following President Obama's 2008 decision to change the approach in Afghanistan toward a more people-centered model, there was a significant reduction in the number of civilian casualties attributable to UN or international forces. By 2014, the average number of civilian casualties per incident was reduced by almost 75%. And this was credited in large part to increased civilian casualty tracking, battle damage assessments, and training. However, what we see from the numbers is that the effects have not sustained over a longer period of time. And the number of civilian casualties attributable to international forces, including the United States, has increased since 2017, both in real terms and based on the percentage attributable to each party. In this figure, you can see the percentage of civilian casualties attributable to international forces from 2013 to 2019. And this is based on the UN mission in Afghanistan reporting, and they really are one of the missions that does the best in terms of monitoring and reporting on civilian casualties. So even though the overall number of casualties decreased in 2019 to the lowest number since 2013, the percentage attributable to international forces has increased to 8%, which is the highest number over the course of the past 7 years. And this is due mostly to the number of airstrikes that have been carried out by pro-government forces, which increased for the 5th consecutive year. So in Afghanistan, airstrikes have caused 10% of all civilian casualties in the country in 2019, and 72% of all airstrikes are carried out by international forces. So this is really a large part of the reason why that we see that number going up. So look at the context of Syria and Iraq for a minute. So in March 2019, the US and international forces achieved territorial defeat over ISIS in Syria, but it has again come at a significant cost to civilians. And similar to the Afghanistan case, these casualties come in particular as a result of US airstrikes. So in order to measure the implementation of civilian harm mitigation in Iraq and Syria, I took the number of civilian casualties per strike and calculated this based on data that is actually published by the US military. So the number of civilian casualties I got from the organization Air Wars, and they provide figures on civilian casualties. And you can see here that Air Wars publishes the number of casualties confirmed by the US military, which is the line that says confirmed, as well as those which Air Wars considers to be fair estimations. So you can see there is a significant discrepancy between the number of casualties reported by the US military and those which are deemed as fair by Air Wars. Nevertheless, regardless of which data is used, it's clear that the 2015 POC military doctrine didn't have a noticeable effect on the number of casualties per strike, as casualties after the doctrine's publication in 2015 were elevated at least until the end of 2017. So when you look at the timing at which this doctrine on CHM comes out and when implementation begins, we really don't see a correlation between that implementation and any sort of a decline in civilian harm. And then finally, in my paper, I look at barriers and enablers for implementation. So what are the different factors that are going on institutionally, culturally, politically, that are either helping or hindering implementation of civilian harm mitigation? So 3 points that I mentioned here. The first one, and really what has been emphasized by a lot of people, both within the military and in the academic literature, is the role of military leadership. So it's really not enough for there to be changes in doctrine. If leadership in the military is not on board and actively taking steps to implement and reinforce this doctrine, we really don't see it making a big difference. So some of the ways that military leadership can emphasize or help to implement CHM, it may come through the issuance of tactical directives, issuing requirements related to monitoring, reporting, and investigations, fire control measures, enhancing battle damage assessment criteria. And even under a very similar doctrine, but with different military leaders, we see very different results. So military leadership seems to be a really important role. The second one is the US military culture, and I label this one as a barrier to implementation. So the United States has long used strategies of total war, strategies of shock and awe, which underpin its approach in warfare. And I would just say that I would really recommend, Bruce Cronin has a book out recently called Bug Splat, where he looks at this really in depth, as well as Austin Lowe's book called The Scale of Armies, where he looks at the culture of the US military and how that is very resistant to change. And so in this case, we really see a dualism, where the US is espousing the idea of civilian protection in its doctrine and in the way that it speaks, while at the same time they continue to rely on approaches of overwhelming force and unrestricted power. And then the third factor is external partners. And this could be either a barrier or an enabler. So increasingly, we've seen that the US military really prefers to be involved with coalition partners. And there are a lot of ways to help to improve accountability. But at the same time, when working with coalition partners, we know that they have varied incentives for participating in operations. They have different political goals, levels of experience, rules of engagement, and they also have different understandings of what their obligations are under international humanitarian law. And so coalition partners can be either a barrier or an enabler. And also when you have more people operating in the same theater, it can remove accountability because it's not always clear who it is that's violating. And so that can be a challenge as well. So in conclusion, my main findings are that it is clear that the United States military has taken steps to incorporate civilian harm mitigation into its doctrine, as well as operations over the past 25 years. However, there are real limitations in the extent to which this doctrine has been implemented, and a reduction in casualties has been quite inconsistent. These shortcomings are likely to remain based on the barriers identified above, in particular the US approach to warfare, which really inevitably entails high levels of civilian casualties. And there's really no reason to think in the near future that that is going to change. Probably the only cases where we would expect to find a real reduction in civilian casualties is where the US finds it to be in its military or political interest. And this could be the case, for example, in COIN operations as part of a winning hearts and minds strategy. Or it could be the case that if the civilian protection regime continues to grow and become more dominant, that the US faces increasing normative pressure to increase the extent to which it's meeting its obligations and even going beyond its obligations under international humanitarian law. So I will stop there and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenna. That was really an exciting paper. I'm looking forward to the discussion regarding this. Let me introduce Joseph Gursky, who is the chairman of Global Conversation. He is going to present a paper called Declining State and Ascending Corporation in the Global Rule of Law. Without further ado, I turn the panel over to Joseph. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you, Joseph. It's a little patchy, but I can hear
There,
you.
can you? Oh, okay, good. Yeah, actually, I prefer to hear more from speaker. I would make the topic.
He's breaking up.
We have a chance to discuss
So
it.
Joseph, you were cutting in and out.
My paper.
You were cutting in and out.
Hear me?
Like the connection is a little patchy here, I feel.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you,
Okay,
but
I'll try to.
sometimes the voice is cutting in and out. So if that happens, I'll write to you in chat.
Okay, good. All right. Let me first read the abstract here of my paper, so I'll get some general overview. Declining state assent incorporation in global rule of law. There are always one methods of global governance being constructed in the 21st century. Yet no aspect of that project is more fundamental the legal base on which global order will be established. If legal development occurs beyond public view or even beyond public awareness, there are ways in which developments can be brought to examination. One approach is to compare the decline of the state and the ending of corporation, two primary legal structures in order of a global future. Changing patterns of governance are arising from a convergence of the two great traditions, Sicilian and Anglophone. In an era by technological innovation and linguistic Anglicization, the principled methods of the civilian are being subsumed by the pragmatic methods of the Anglophone. Comparing the civilian origin of the modern nation state with the Anglophone origins of the modern multinational corporation provides a way of understanding a postmodern rule of law that's being constructed for all peoples and regions of the earth. I use the terms civilian. Some people are not conversant with the ideas. This is continental European law. That tradition is operative in most 9/10 probably countries of the world. And what I call Anglophone law is usually referred to as Anglo-American law or the British common law, and it's operative primarily in states that were once colonial status under the British rule. Let me read a little bit more here. My apologies for reading this, but
Joseph,
I'm not.
sorry if I have to. Joseph, can I pause you for a little bit? I'm really sorry to say this, but your voice is cutting in and out to an extent that it's almost like I can only get like parts of your sentences.
Oh, really?
Yes. And is that the same happening with Luba and Jenna as well? Right.
I got Jenna almost perfectly.
Right. So I think
I didn't hear Luba
happening.
speak.
It might be that something is happening on your end so that it's kind of cutting in and off.
It's very.
If I may suggest, I sometime because when we teach classes online, is that we all put our microphones on mute because it bounces off from a different. So if all of us, the three of us, put it on mute and let Joseph talk, maybe we can minimize the kind of echoing. So that's why I did turn mine off.
All right, try that and give a thumbs up if
he kind of
you can
bounces
hear
off.
me, okay?
Yeah.
All right.
So I'm going to turn my microphone off.
Around 8:30, I will give you show you a hand so that you can wrap up your part of the and then get into the discussion part.
Okay.
All right,
okay.
thank you. Sorry for that.
So I'm
interruption.
Okay. This paper is in 5 parts. The first part of it talks about the origins of the nation state and the multinational corporation. Historically, legal scholars from continental Europe have made the most dramatic advances in the traditions of Western law. This was especially true during the 17th century. New forms of government and commerce were being constructed, and as the search for rule by instruments of encoded law was broadening. Inevitably, this concerned methods for ordering relations of persons and things, matters urgently important to those who sought to govern. At the time, quite naturally, there was a reliance on old forms: kingship, religion, heredity, nobility, guilds, orders, burghs, estates, old forms that familiar had by experience proven to be reliable. But across Europe was also a search for ways back to medieval legal traditions: the Romanized jus commune, or common law of Christendom, and the commercial law, the lex mercatoria, to fit the new circumstance. Out of this search were developed novel techniques by which sovereign powers could be exercised, controlled, delegated, and extended. At the time, both England and on the continent, both these emergent forms of administering and enforcing were not always clearly defined or understood. Especially, for example, what in modern times would be called a state, a republic, a commonwealth, a corporation, a trust, or a company were not precisely distinguished from one another. In fact, in different contexts, each term might have a different meaning, while in other situations, certain of these terms are used almost interchangeably. Such confusions were even more pronounced in English practice because its jurisprudence was by nature both explicit and opaque. In the Anglophone realm, the lack of distinction can be seen in 2 well-known examples during the 19th century. One concerns the method by which England was ruled from 1653 to 1659 under a form of government called the Commonwealth. It was a harsh, militaristic, and democratic rule, but it had many standard features of a modern state. It held a question of over the land and people and its borders. It had judicial and legislative capacity, a means of taxation, as well as an army to fight wars and to quell domestic rebellion. But in an era when the term sovereignty was often virtually synonymous with the idea of ownership, the Commonwealth also had many properties typical of modern corporation. Certain briefs, including the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, acted very much like the officers and proprietors of an enterprise for amassing property and wealth. As a result, under the Commonwealth, tens of thousands of small landholders were driven from their lands and villages, holdings that by right of tenure had often became family for generations. Large tracts were assembled, their chapels and markets dwellings leveled, as the arable land was divided among members of a newly emergent ruling caste. In the process, the mechanisms of this ruling structure produced the material benefits of a modern business conglomerate, and all was accomplished with scrupulous attention to requirements of a newly propounded law. An enormous population of disinherited and disenfranchised people were expelled from the countryside, reduced to abject poverty, and forced to occupy house tenement in the cities. Great land estates were founded out of what had once been many separate farmsteads. If looked on as a commercial venture, the Commonwealth would not have been more successful. The effects of its tenure amounted to one of the great transfers of wealth and property in ancient Irish history. A little bit more of this early beginnings. If you understand the early beginning of the corporation and the state, then the current role and how developing in competition with one another becomes more understandable. By contrast, and during the same period of the 17th century, the India Company, founded in 1600, was modeled very much like a modern multinational corporation. It was a creature of its stockholders, intended to exploit the servile labor and inexhaustible resources of distant regions, especially India. In fact, in the 2nd century, the East India Company became the primary conduit by which wealth was extracted from the Indian subcontinent. What had been a land of ancient and fabulous opulence became a war-rich territory inhabited by an impoverished and subjugated population. One reason for this effect was that the East India Company had many of the characteristics of a modern totalitarian state. Actually, the story is a little more complicated than this, but this is substantially true. The East India Company held absolute and unquestioned authority over the land and peoples of India. Under its appointed officials, it had its own law courts, its own municipal bodies, as well as officers of tax and tariff. It had a military force to resist taxation from the outside and to support rebellion from within. One of the most astonishingly successful commercial endeavors of all time, it was said to have provided the initial capital by which the Industrial Revolution was launched in England. But it was also, until its dissolution in 1857, a remarkable example of governance wielded through a corporate entity established for the purpose of stockholder enrichment. That's kind of the old history for most of us, but the point of that is not only to show the origins, and if we get the origins right, we can understand the subsequent development more clearly, but also see that viewed historically, these two entities, these two legal structures that we think as being very different, can in fact and historically have often been and now are becoming less distinguishable from one another. And in many ways, the corporation is displacing the nation's traditional rule. How do I have?
I think we are going towards the end. We can afford 3 more minutes.
All right, let me just hit the end here. I don't want to bore you to death. I'm really sorry that I'm reading this, but the fifth part of the final part is called Transcendence and Opacity. The corporation today offers other advantages, for example, through that instrument, judicial authority on the effect of reaching far beyond its own national boundary into the territory of other states. Corporation could provide, in effect, an extraterritorial probe from one legal regime into the domestic affairs of another. Also, with new technical abilities, the corporation could provide all the necessary provisions and resources for the feeding and clothing of populations. It might provide military presence in the form of weapons, strategic advice, even increasing frequency mercenary soldiers. All these factors blur artificial dichotomies of public and private, political and legal, national and international. And I'm talking in the world today. In the past, the role of education has fallen to the state, but with new technological advances, nothing could equal the various electronic media as instruments for shaping public norms and values. Unlike the old brick-and-mortar school system with its instilled ideology and its laborious method of rote learning, the media could create an atmosphere of understanding that was continuous and ubiquitous in its effects. It required little effort on the part of the learner because lessons were absorbed in the course of a normal day. It provided an atmosphere for understanding political and world affairs, information the public needed to acclimate and participate in a world regimen of governance. Nothing could match its potential ability to instill habits of acceptance and compliance, a crucial necessity for a rule of law. Just one more paragraph. From the perspective of English legal practice or Anglophone legal practice or American legal practice, the new corporate atmosphere posed a useful challenge to the structure of the nation state and the existing international system of world order. A process of supersession by a new global law would even require direct confrontation with the old legality. It only required that the role of the nation state be allowed to recede and decline. The technologically articulated realm of the corporation could fully supplant the structures of international law because, in effect, it operated in a different legal reality that wholly enveloped the international system. Okay, I'll stop there. I hope you could understand that and it wasn't too tedious.
No, thank you so much, Joseph. There were a couple of times, the feed was coming in and out, but I was following you through the paper, so it was understandable for me. Thank you so much, and I want to turn over this time to Luba Rukanska, who is going to discuss the papers. You are free to take any one in order, and then we will open up for a little bit of questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to go in the order that they were presented. I'm going to start with Jenna, and then I go to Joseph. First, I want to say thank you for presenting your papers. They were very interesting. I read them and enjoyed them very much. Clearly, two very different papers, so there is nothing I can kind of say how they compare or contrast, etc. Very different, obviously subjects. So I'll just take Jenna first, and let me just say I find it very fascinating. I don't do military strategy, but I do foreign affairs. So I'm very much involved in studying very much now the whole Asia Pacific, right? China, Russia. I'm a foreign policy person. So I find many of that, what you discussed, very useful and very timely. So I want to first say that very much. I believe that the paper you put together is has a very good discussion explanation. One thing I would have liked more of it is the theoretical concept. The reason why is because I would like to see what actually you wanted to conclude it with certain proposal, right? So you did a terrific summary of it. You provided us with, like different, 3 levels of possible, looking at, why the civilian casualties have not drastically reduced percentage-wise, and depending on what system we're using for counting or identifying civilian casualties. That is extremely useful, right? Because you provided enormous number of information for us to kind of understand and analyze and digest, so to speak. But what I was looking for then is for you to tell us does one more promising than the other? And so just by the way, just saying they both have the same thing, or they both could present either the positive, the negative, we were left kind of a little bit kind of like in the dark. So I would like you to think of it when you present it next time, or when you want to stay with the subject, to actually tell us, is one more suited, one of the measurement which you express and show us a lot of graphs, is it more suited or more capable of actually analyzing the statistically significant measurements for if the number of casualties is significantly more reduced in terms of actually it's significant in a quantitative way. I know you didn't use quantitative analysis, but you had those kind of comparative graphical examples. So I find it, again, extremely informative. I think it dealt with subject in terms of the wars. You compared 3 wars, and the one particular, it was the way the military's culture and the idea of using war as success at any cost. Those type of wars, I think, didn't happen in those 3 countries you talked about, correct? Because it was mostly wars of what is it? I don't, the terms that you were using in your presentation. I don't have the paper.
Mostly counterinsurgency.
Yes, counterinsurgency. So those are not precisely the one. I forget the 3 measurements used, but it's the one that I think the military culture. You said is the idea of winning at any cost, the shock and awe, right? They were not applied. That system was not applied to any of the three cases you used. Am I correct?
No, actually, that's not the case. And in fact, in the Bruce Cronin book that I mentioned, Bug Splat, he talks about still, the U.S. military's willingness to really push the boundaries in the types of military strategies they use that sort of inevitably entail high levels of civilian casualties. Because when you're talking about things like the rule of proportionality under international humanitarian law, that's very subjective, and that the US tends to take an approach that, really relies on overwhelming force. Now, the exception to that, of course, and one of the points I was trying to make is that if you're in a situation where you're trying to win hearts and minds and you're trying to win over communities, you may find that it's in your tactical interest to try and lower civilian casualties and lower levels of destruction, because you're kind of trying to win that battle for hearts and minds of the local community members. So it can do it when it wants to, but it has to be in its strategic interest, and that's the problem.
Yeah, of course. I think that was another interesting point, that in the discussion of the how the directives or the new military strategy and et cetera that you introduced at the beginning of your paper clearly is very valuable and important, and how it is applied, that's where I was a little bit lost, because basically at that point need to be a little more tighter and more specific theoretically. Otherwise it is just descriptive. And in the conclusion, that's why I was kind of left a little bit hanging, right? I would again appreciate, and I'm telling you, it's a fantastically interesting, especially because you brought military into the civilian, right? You're discussing civilians, but affected in a very, very different kind of military. It's a strategy versus the civilians. Obviously, very important, very important topic. So I agree with you on everything you said. I think it is exceptionally well structured as a way of introducing these concepts. Where I would suggest, or urge you to, is to look at create more theory into it, and then maybe explain which, if you're going to introduce 2 or 3 different, possibilities, it will be helpful for you to at least come to a conclusion that one is more than the other, or at least comparatively explain why one would be more productive way of analyzing precisely what you were trying to analyze in this paper, increase or decrease. This actually has impact on decrease casualties. And one last thing, I don't know, again, war is, I do study war, but in a different way than you were doing the particular military strategy of the United States, dealing with this one important issue. It's the question of, in the counterinsurgency, of course, it's a non-traditional warfare, right? I mean, and there was a lot of discussion, especially in Iraq, this idea of the human shields. I mean, how again that you address that issue in a different way. You've said sometimes very difficult to how we count the casualty. I mean, and in your paper, even more specifically, when you sometimes information can be not exactly as it seems. And I think that's the difficulty too, because in a non-traditional warfare, counterinsurgency, which both of those three places were mostly during the period you were covering, were involved, it is difficult to, and I think that will also need a little more clarification. Exactly the data you used, the FAIR you explained very well. How does it then has an impact? Because the FAIR is going to be always, it could kind of be taken both ways. As you said, the gap was enormous, right? The military reported it much lower than the other organizations. So I think that needs to be addressed a little more, but really very informative paper, extremely well written. I really applaud you, and I enjoy reading it. So thank you so much for that. And anyway, I have a couple of questions, but the questions I'm going to do as a way during our kind of a group discussion, I guess. For Joseph, thank you very much. Extremely interesting paper too, very different from Jenna's, obviously. And but I do want to comment because it has some aspect that I know a little more about. Now I'm going to leave the historical part totally, unfortunately, because I'm not historian, but it was an extremely good way because again, it's a comparative, right? You showed us what happened in history in the 17th century and so on, and then you brought it into 21st century. So I'm going to mostly comment on the 21st century, but because in your paper, I see that why it was actually necessary, at least the way you structured it, to go into showing how states, nation states, compare, because your argument, if I'm reading it correctly, is the nation state is on decline, correct? And that
yes.
you feel that it is the corporations that will be more conducive to the modern age of globalization. Am I reading that also correctly?
Yeah, I mean, that is generally. Yes.
Anyway, so let me just finish and then of course we can have discussion. So the way I looked at this discussion is that in international relations, because that's what I teach IR, is that state is of course at this point the only legal entity as an actor. There is nothing, international relations, we have anarchy about that. So you address that as a way of something you want to call global law. And that's when I have questions, because that's so interesting. We have international law, and as you know, international law is created by states. So anything international, all the organizations have either state as actors, etc., and they follow rules or law or mandates created by states, either within the IOs or obviously other international organizations. So at this point, at least in Ireland, we don't believe there's anything higher, all right, in anarchy. It's just, there's no other centralized government. So the corporations, I find your concept actually very illuminating and worthwhile to discuss, to be honest with you, is that you believe, or at least you say in your paper, that it is corporations which transcend this because they create their own kind of legal, right, laws or concepts that they transcend the boundaries of the state, which is limiting. And therefore, because they are free to kind of go across the borders, right? But here is the question I have as I was reading it. They are not states. They don't have law. They don't create laws. They follow laws. So how do corporations, how are corporations then compared to states when they don't create laws, but are ruled by laws? Even if they transcend the border. If American corporation goes to China, for example, it's still, when it comes to China, has to follow Chinese law that Chinese state created. It's not international law that these corporations follow. and states follow international law created by states, WTO and UN and all that. It's all state created. So this is where I'm kind of wanted to ask you how you thought about it, because if corporations are the kind of transcend the state and state can decline, how are corporations filling it? Because then what type of system would that be on the IR level as a international system? If states, because right now it's created by states, so how would corporations then create this global international system? That's something perhaps you can address. And then it was a fascinating idea. I mean, I obviously read literature, I understand why the idea of state disappearing. I know that comes from I understand all that, but you kind of propose somehow the corporations, interestingly, would kind of fill that gap, and I would like to hear about that more. So in terms of what happens in that space above the states, but we have in IR, obviously called anarchy. You mentioned Wendt, and of course he does talk about it. He does have some constructive ideas about that, but he addressed it still.
What was that? What was that?
You have one of the authors you kind of cite is Wendt, right? And he is, yes. But you tried it in different way. I know him only as someone who's constructivist in IR, who talks about that states can create some kind of structure in the anarchy. But but we still come back to states. So again, I find your discussion very interesting, kind of different, because you're looking at it through a very different prism, rather than you see the decline of state as something that perhaps is positive, and you see something that is going to take something that the global law, the international law. Again, I would ask, who is creating that? Because at this point in international system, states created. So if it would kind of nice for you or good for you, I would love to hear your thinking on that. Who is going to create this global law that would then take over what the international system that state created? So those are the only comments I have at this point. Again, very different papers coming from very different perspectives, different subjects. So, and I do appreciate your effort, because they were both very interesting to read, and thank you so much. So I'll leave it, I have some questions as we go, but at this point, that's what I would like to offer as my comments. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for the response.
Thank you, Luba. That was excellent. We have a lovely perspective on both papers with certain comments and ideas from where we can go. I just wanted to open it up for a group discussion. Of course, we can't take Q&A from an invisible crowd that will see it later on, but maybe I should start with a couple of questions I have. And incidentally, I remembered I didn't introduce myself. I'm Anirban Acharya, and I'm a professor of political science in Lemoyne College. I will start with Jen. I have a couple of questions, or rather comment-laced questions, rather. One important thing that we see with US foreign policy in recent years is the usage of drones, and also the changing of the definition of who is the non-competent authority, who is considered to be non-combatant. And as a result, there has been a growing amount of literature and work that has been coming out, which shows that United States have used this as a way to say that this is actually reducing collateral damage. That drone warfare doesn't create havoc damage. It's a way to make a more gentler warfare. But the criticism of that is that in many cases, US during the Obama administration didn't even know how many people they were killing in Afghanistan. They were counts between 17 and 23, between 14 and 19. And at the same time, a lot of people were killed based on certain algorithms. I remember one of the earlier drone strikes was based. They thought it was Osama bin Laden, but the algorithm or the intelligence was based on the height of the person, and it was just a normal person, right? It's just a farmer or something like that. So I guess the question and comment is to be bringing in this kind of new technology of warfare that US foreign policy experts or US foreign policy is saying that, this is a way to do civilian harm mitigation, right? It's a technology that kills less people and kills less soldiers. But there is also a very counter argument to that, which says that no, actually, this has increased civilian casualty because it takes away that organic aspect of being in the field. You are using it from some base in United States. So here, Gregory Chamau's book, a theory of drones, I think would be very interesting to look at, and then really parse that idea of like, you can always show that less civilians are dying if you change the meaning of the word civilian, right? So I think there was, don't remember it very correctly, but there was this idea that United States definition was saying that anybody above 16 years of age were seen to be combatants in Afghanistan at certain points, right? So that again changes, but overall, I think it's an absolutely lovely paper. And then I will just maybe just one more about regarding Joseph's work. I don't know whether you're familiar with Slobodian's work, which comes out about neoliberalism. This is in a new Harvard University.
I think that's in the.
He does cite it.
That's the one great.
Right. So following that argument, I feel that one way to reconcile what Luba is asking you, that the states are the primary actors, right? How do corporations become in that way primary actors? Slobodian says that the neoliberal project, the political project, was basically creating a world system of movement of global capital under which the states make themselves subservient. So it is an active giving up of certain powers to a broader global flow of capital. And as a result, states start behaving like corporations or start behaving as if they want a certain freedom of corporations at the global level. So to that extent, nation states are losing their power, but it is not really, much of it is also through policy making and with this idea that there's this two-layered governance. At one layer, the nation states are sovereign, but then Slobodian shows that the neoliberal project tries to create this other layer where nation states don't have any more power. And they cite the example of European Union being one of those projects. So those are my two comments and kind of questions if you want to deal with that I talk about. And I'll stop now. Thanks.
Thank you. Actually, let me say, I buy many books, but I don't read so many. I used to read everything cover to skim, but Slobodian book is I had to read every word of it. That's a really extent. I wouldn't claim he would endorse what I'm saying, although I don't see a con. Let me also say that the state is still very important, especially in its increments. One more thing is that development law are not always formally expressed, or they're always made explicit. Sometimes these things happen informally. One of the things about Anglophone legal culture, for example, is that it has elements that are ancient, medieval, modern, and postmodern. Some of the elements of Anglophone law we don't think of in terms of being legal in the modern sense, but they're very important in that legal culture.
Thank you.
Yeah,
you would see that. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to Anirban. I think that the conversation about drones is so fascinating, and I wish I could remember the author's name, and I'm sorry, it escapes me in the moment, but I remember reading a fantastic piece a while back about international law and drones. And perhaps you're more familiar with this than I am because this is your area, but the idea of kind of proportional risk between both sides. And when you have combatant versus combatant on the field, they're both in the theater of operations, and there is this level of proportional risk. When you remove one of those actors from the field and they're thousands of miles away sitting behind a computer operating a drone, and that changes the rules of the game. And a lot of what we understand in terms of obligations under international humanitarian law was crafted prior to this technology. And the laws have not entirely kept up with the nature of the game. And so I think that is part of what needs to be revisited right now, not only in the case of drones, but also, as you mentioned, sort of shifting ideas of who counts as a combatant, and what does it mean that we're not allowed to target civilians, and what do we do when we have people that are combatants in one moment and civilians in the next moment, and how do we understand those shifts? Most of my research, in fact, focuses sort of on normative understandings of civilian protection. And so a lot of what I have looked at is, how do we understand who deserves protection? Who are we obligated to protect? And who does that apply to, in particular through gendered lenses, as well as other sort of assumptions that are being made about who is a legitimate target and who is not. One of the ways that I think that the United States has received a lot of scrutiny is for having sort of relaxed ideas of who is a legitimate target through these so-called signature strikes. And again, this is where I come back to this idea that there's sort of a dualism within the United States, where on the one hand, they really give lip service to this idea of civilian protection and human rights. On the other hand, they've really been scrutinized, and including in particular President Obama, for his use of signature strikes and having less restrictive standards when it comes to determining who is a legitimate target in these cases. So I think that, and I guess coming back to what Lubis said too, maybe one of the reasons why I struggled a bit in the theory section is because the more, I looked at these different theories of change in military doctrine, and the more I looked at the US case, the more I kept thinking, well, it's not quite fitting in any of these boxes. And I don't know if we need maybe a new theory to explain.
It does have to. I think this is pretty much, I think you're absolutely on the right track. And I think it will be very helpful, for you to start thinking in terms of kind of out of the box, because if you stick with, you would, that's to say, you would terrific kind of almost kind of like giving us you really nicely extracted the most important information from, I'm sure, a lot of literature. And so it was very informative for that. But now I'm waiting for that shock and awe, right? As you said, that comes with precisely the idea suddenly, and that's the hard part, I understand. But if that's what now is necessary, processor technology is different. Once the type of war changes, right? I mean, it happened so quickly with, now we talk about, now the whole strategy is about cyber war, of course, which I find fascinating, but really I want to stay away from it, because then I would not do what I want to do at this point. But that's the whole progression of weapons. And I think that's what Joseph's also talked about, technology as being the driving force, why states could, totally decline or disappear, and some other entity will take over. So technology is taking things over, yes. So that was perhaps one thing that tied these two papers together, which is kind of interesting. But then who is, unfortunately, it's never going to change, I think. Then who's driving the technology? Is it, in other words, there has to be something, there's an entity. Is it state, corporations, is, who? And I think that's also the second important question. Because it has an impact on the strategy. Is the military driving, or is the military really only absorbing? Because the technology is changing the military as well, right? From traditional warfare to, let's say drones, a computer or cyberspace, and wars only taking space, taking place in space, like we're going to field the satellites and then we go throw something out there. So, but this still requires explanation and some kind of theoretical concept that we could then debate. And I think that's what I think we are all thinking about, right? So Joseph, please.
Well, it's one thing to think about technology as a dominant force or as something that develops anarchically, and on a certain level it does, but it also develops within a legal context and against the backdrop of legally established norms. So in the development of technology, its development is governed by law, or that maybe certain types of technology are deemed illegal and prohibited by law. It's an instrument of law. So no technology can be developed that contradicts the purposes of legal rule. I'm simplifying this. So it's one thing to say that technology is doing this. It's another way to look at it is if we had a different legal culture, the technology that has been developed might possibly be used in very different ways. So technology is an instrument. And of course, it creates its own problems and has its own momentum, but it's governed, it's created. Technological corporations are incorporated by law. Research is financed by institutions that are basically legal constructs. And so the way about technology is that it's a creation or is fostered by law and it becomes a creation of law. Just
Well, I think the technology is changing how, I mean, the law only comes in after the technology is created. So technology happens, right? I mean, I assume that when they found, the internet, or they found, an Apple phone, now we can actually have videos, and we can, like we do now, we can actually talk, like to be in the same room. That technology developed. But then the rules came how to control that technology. So I agree with you. I mean, globalization here to stay, but I also want to make just one more last point, because you talk about the technology. The whole globalization this is not a new thing, because globalization, as we, at least in IR, we only look at it in terms of trade and finance moving across borders. And that happened even that's why I'm going to bring your history to fore, is that happened with the East India Company. That's globalization right there. So you have an example in 17th century. That's not what's new, is the technology, the speed of that globalization, which means the movement of trade and finance across border is not ships months and months. It is all basically instantaneous.
But that was again the result, as I think mentioned in the paper. I can't remember the three great inventions. So the maritime compass made that it's called the first globalization possible.
Sorry, I didn't catch that, but that's
another, just one thing. Those technologies, the maritime compass, gunpowder weapons, and existed in Islam and in China, probably in India. I'm not sure about that. Before the West, but those civilizations were so deeply rooted in a way of life that those were only used as instruments or embellishments to establish life. In the West is that they became the foundation of way of life. That's when what we call the West began to take off in the 16th century, when this new basis rule, basis was established on a technology foundation. And that's the point I try to make. I don't remember if it's, I think it was. I write so many papers, I don't remember what it's all about.
Thank you, Joseph. Again, it was cutting in and out. One thing I think we are running out of almost time. One thing I wanted to say, like, as if I can put on my political economy hat, which is one of my subfields, technology in the endogenous growth theory literature, it seemed to be coming out from institutions. So institutions is the independent variable that kind of drives the technological or drives the payoff structure in a society, which drives technology further. So from that perspective, I think states are crucial for dissemination and creation of technologies. But
definitely.
And one thing I could find an interesting relation between the two papers is that, in US wars, for example, in Iraq, US has and their allies have increasingly relied on mercenaries, right? Corporations that actually are private corporations, right? That send in soldiers, right? And they fight or they do certain security projects or some sort of that. And it was like after the US Army that, the private corporation-led soldiers were one of the highest in numbers. So that's kind of interesting in two papers to see, the rise of the fall of state and erstwhile what states used to do, they're retreating from that and allowing corporations to do, which again works with the idea that, if we are to talk about civilian harm mitigation, right, then to what extent corporations and military contractors who had created a lot of atrocities and so on, to what extent they, are within this particular legal environment and so on. But I think this was, given the circumstances of the pandemic, lovely discussion. Thank you, Luba, very much. And thank you, Jenna and Joseph.
Yes, thank you for the comments, Luba. And what is it, Jenna? Really interesting topic, and I think because right now in kind of period of ambivalence, a lot of questions about American and the world, your kind of idea to be put out without, and earlier it just sounded like another anti-war voice. This time it might be ideas that people are ready to hear about and consider. I think it's very important.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Are we out of time?
Yes, we are a little bit past time. I mean, depending upon how we started.
Thank you so much for, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
It was
very good. Thank you.
Informative. Thank you so much
Nice
for
to meet
all
everybody.
your
Thank you so
presentations.
much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Good night. Take
Goodbye.
care.
Bye. So Luba, I'm going to just post this now. Then I'm going to stop the recording.